Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this discussion. It's a treat to have Jonathan Pollack back at the ISS, and we're particularly grateful because he only just flew into London this morning, stoked himself up with some caffeine earlier, got a few winks, I think, in the hotel lobby, and has come over here. But
that's my excuse if I'm incoherent. Right.
And as many of you will know, Jonathan is a senior fellow at the Thornton Center for China Studies at Brookings. He also holds the Korea Chair at the Center for Northeast Asian Studies at Brookings, and for Brookings at the moment he's in the process of completing a volume on the endangered regional order in Asia, and looking at questions of strategic risk and revisionism. And as we were coming up in the elevator right now, we were reflecting on the fact that the sources of the revisionism had maybe increased a little bit in the last 12 months in ways not initially anticipated by the draft that Jonathan had been intending to produce. As far as his other books are concerned, we at the ISS are very proud to have been the publishers of his 2011 Adelphi on North Korea, which had the title No Exit, Hui Klo being the Sartre reference. But that was a real deep dive into what has ultimately proved to be, as we all know, an entrenched and a persistent security problem that's again in the news just again this morning. So Jonathan has set himself the exam question of does Trump have an Asia policy in mind? I haven't gone through Jonathan's detailed bio, because all you really need to know is that he is one of the most informed, insightful, and I would say wise Asia policy analysts in Washington. And given the exam question you set yourself, you're going to need to be, frankly.
Yes, right.
And in the Q&A session, we might also, I suppose, get into the question of whether Asia has a Trump policy.
Yes, that's the flip side, right?
Yeah. Okay, so Jonathan, you'll speak for a bit, and then we'll have some comments and questions.
Well, thank you, Adam, and it's a pleasure to be back here at the Institute today, availing myself of the opportunity as long as I'm here on an absurdly short visit, and thank you for all coming. What I want to do is talk a bit about what we saw from Trump as a candidate, what we saw him in transition, and now what we see in him as president with respect to East Asia. The conclusions I'll offer are probably a little different from what I'll call the conventional wisdom. He seems to offend people on a daily or even sometimes an hourly basis, and yet, as I'll talk about it, he can in some context, and I must say I've never met President Trump, so I'm not speaking from direct experience, but speaking to people who have had direct contact with him, that he can be in private much more deliberative, much more prepared to listen, and the like, but a lot of this doesn't always come across in a public context, just given his larger style. Though I would note, and this is sort of an opening point, is that arguably he has spent more time focused on East Asia than on any other region of the world since becoming president. And to some extent he's learning as he goes. So I'll talk about that. When he was candidate, beginning there very, very quickly, that there were a whole set of fears and anxieties driven by what his priorities seemed to be, even though you could say that he was elected very, very much on what I will loosely call a domestic agenda. There were elements that filtered over, particularly on issues related to trade, that seemed to dominate his worldview. So on trade, his absolute insistence that he would cancel the Trans-Pacific Partnership either on day one of his presidency or very, very close to it. He fulfilled that. He did say, by the way, repeatedly that on day one of his presidency he would declare China a currency manipulator, even though it is not in the power of the President of the United States to deem whether a country is a currency manipulator or not. And he did not follow through on that. Other things that were a source of great concern were almost these breezy comments he would make about nuclear weapons, in effect arguing that, well, maybe we shouldn't be defending our allies. Maybe Japan and South Korea should have nuclear weapons of their own. Seeming to walk away from his alliance commitments, and more generally, in a very, very active way, challenging and questioning the whole basis on which the United States had conducted its foreign policy in Asia for a number of decades. He had a variety of comments and tweets on North Korea that really made no sense because they were all over the map. And it went everything from a random comment about sitting down and having a hamburger with Kim Jong-un to other things of just insisting, well, this is China's job. They should just take care of him, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you added this all up, as it was observed, I think by somebody from The Atlantic, the question, in looking at all of Trump's activities and his words, his angry temperament and all that, did you take him both literally and seriously? The argument being that his opponents took him literally, whereas his supporters took him more seriously, but not literally. So we have, in effect, tests in the early stages of his presidency, first as president-elect. I mentioned before already that he immediately pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Some of his early appointments on trade, including Peter Navarro, this professor from the business school at the University of California, Irvine, with, shall we say, very loopy views on the basis of trade balances as a factor in how you understood them, that got no credence at all from any serious economist, but also had some incredibly alarmist views of China, really pulsate even to movies that he had produced. Mr. Navarro, I don't know how many of you have followed him, but he was sort of an odd duck in a lot of ways. He ran for political office 6 times when he was a professor, sometimes as a Democrat, sometimes as a Republican, sometimes as an independent, failed on all of them. But now he sort of has his moment in the sun with policies that in essence are economically nationalist, just to slap a label on it. Though there are others that Trump appointed that also fit in that label, but maybe none quite as extreme as Professor Navarro. The other indications that early on seemed quite troubling is, again, he took a phone call from President Tsai in Taiwan, which seemed not to perturb the Chinese too much immediately, but it was only a few days later when he ruminated over the idea that, well, why should we really follow this one China policy? It should be up for negotiations till we get something on trade. And this is Trump's natural transactional style, free-thinking style, whatever comes into his head. But this is an example of where very, very quickly, upon becoming president, he has walked this back in a significant way, sufficient that there were assurances given to Xi Jinping in a phone call that there was not going to be any significant shift in the broad parameters of U.S.-China policy that had been followed by every president since Nixon. Other factors that shaped what he was thinking and doing with respect to East Asia. Most prominently, I would note that 2 days after his election, he met with President Obama at the White House, and by all accounts, President-elect Trump, was deeply sobered by what Obama told him about questions with respect to North Korea. And you will note that except for one small tweet about Trump saying in early January, a nuclear-armed North Korea reaching the United States, it's not going to happen. That was one tweet. Other than that, there have been no presidential tweets on North Korea. That's because there's actually serious policy deliberation underway. And the president has met with U.S. intelligence officials, notwithstanding the other fights he's picking with the intelligence community. He's listening to people. I can't presume to say exactly what the outcome of this deliberation process is. You could say, in some sense, it happens every time you get a new president. You have to have a Korea policy review. And usually you end up in about the same place as your predecessors. But the nature of the issues have changed profoundly, particularly over the last year, because of the heightened pace of the North's weapons testing. And so Obama, in essence, said to him, this is going to be an urgent issue in your presidency. Maybe we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Other indications. Prime Minister Abe had beseeched first President Obama, obviously, but then President-elect Trump to stick with TPP. Abe having made a number of commitments that have long been sought from the United States on opening of some very, very closed markets in Japan. These are not new issues, but Trump was not going to be deterred. So Abe was the first out of the gate. He got an appointment with Trump early on, gave him a gold golf club in New York. This was the first indication that Trump's immediate family was playing a direct role in policymaking, in that his daughter, Ivana, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, were present for the meeting with Mr. Abe. So if nothing else, you could argue this was unconventional as an approach. You're talking about people who were not, although they may have titles. Kushner is, I think, listed as a senior advisor or something. I'm not quite sure what his title is. So he's working in the White House. But this was very much derivative of how Trump conducted himself in the business world. The Trump organization, as it is called, is very, very small. It's very personal. There have been estimates worldwide on the number of actual employees. It's an inconsequential number for what is some kind of a global brand in some sense. He relies very much on a small circle of subordinates, some of whom have worked for him for decades, in whom he trusts and whom he delegates responsibility to. So in a way, you could say this was going from his life in the business world, where of course he had no board of directors to report to, no shareholders to report to, and then trying to impose that on his experiences as first as president-elect and now as president. The verdict is still out on that for all kinds of obvious reasons, and we may come back to that. Other indications, and this speaks to the issue that Adam raised or that I posed about whether there's an Asia policy. Trump clearly prefers one-on-one deliberations with senior people in separate systems. He has a kind of an inbuilt distaste for, contempt of multilateralism. He doesn't like big, broad trade agreements. It's just not his style. He wants to do these things one-on-one. And the irony here may be that as he maps out what he does in Asia, and it's really in Northeast Asia, I'm unaware of any dealings at this point, maybe even not at the ambassadorial level, of any of his senior people with the Trump administration. I mean, his dealings are related to Japan, South Korea, and China, the three countries that Tillerson, the Secretary of State, is now visiting. The other thing that I would say, relevant to those that he is employing in government at the cabinet level, is almost all of them are totally newcomers to the governmental process. Very few of them have had prior experience in government. And in a lot of cases, he doesn't even know them all that well. He only met Tillerson, even knew his name, maybe about 3 or 4 days before he appointed him Secretary of State, which seems, at a minimum, rather unusual. But this is Trump's style. If he feels comfortable with someone, he has gut sentiments, this is how he proceeds, for better or for worse. But I would emphasize very, very much the idea that you look at relationships one by one. So this was true in his efforts to pull back from potential great difficulties with China. Trump will host Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago. I don't think they'll go golfing, but he will be there April 6th and 7th, I think. There have been quiet dealings with Cui Tiankai, the Chinese ambassador. Ironically, with respect to China, or for that matter, with respect to Japan, the whole desire to have personal relationships and personal access very, very high up in the U.S. system has long been a goal, has long been a kind of a time-honored practice. So in that sense, Trump may actually have a style that works if these are means by which the issues at stake can be effectively managed. And of course, that's a very, very big question mark. There's evidence that we will start bilateral negotiations with Japan on some of the trade issues that vex him. I should say that Trump's first public comments on issues about trade and the like go back to things he said about Japan 30 years ago. There's an enormous continuity, not only with reference to Japan, but also going from Japan to China. But one of the things that I think he has had to pull back from is that Trump and some of those around him have had a tendency to conflate trade imbalances with burden sharing and alliances. The reality is, whatever the grievances Trump has about the role and the contributions of allies, they do not extend to Korea and Japan, because Korea and Japan contribute now, and I think he gets this even if some of his words indicate otherwise. But unlike his grievance list with respect to most members of NATO, in East Asia, you're talking about states that pay a lot, contribute a great deal. Now, he may push and prod for more, but that's not really where the focal point of his concerns. This has particular resonance right now, I would say, with respect to Korea. As we all know, South Korea has been going through an enormous internal political crisis that, although a couple of his incoming trade officials have made some remarks about trade issues with Korea, it's the fifth anniversary now of the U.S.-Korea trade agreement, but he hasn't said anything himself. And I think that may be partly reflecting the sensitivities of the situation that Seoul confronts right now. But it does show, I mean, again, amidst all of his words, all of his visibility, all of his efforts to dominate the news cycle, he can be quiet on some things, at least some of the time. We'll come back to that perhaps. On the other hand, if you talk about his organization of policymaking at the White House, the national security process, we're all familiar with General Flynn's travails, and he's gone. Here at the IISS, you of course know General McMaster very, very well, and McMaster is an impressive guy. Very, very honorable, very intense guy. Not any Asia background that I can discern, and that's one of the question marks right now, is who in his circle or in various cabinet posts has meaningful Asia background. Defense Secretary Mattis, who of course was the first cabinet member to travel abroad and went to Korea and Japan, he had some experience in Korea as a young soldier, but his dominant focus was obviously elsewhere. It's been on the wars in the Middle East. So, but this is a larger problem right now, and this is one of the things that I think people are finding somewhat perturbing, is that he has a group of cabinet secretaries. He's named a few ambassadors, but that's it. Most of the positions in the United States government that require Senate confirmation are empty. In fact, people haven't even been announced. This finds its most immediate illustration with respect to Secretary of State Tillerson, who's in Seoul today, will go to Beijing, I guess, tomorrow. Tillerson has tried to recruit a Deputy Secretary of State. The politicals at the White House have said no for various reasons to the candidates that he's offered. He has no Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. He has an acting, very, very capable Foreign Service officer named Susan Thornton. But it's the sort of these improvised arrangements when we're so used to having in the United States government appointments made early, a process undertaking that is observable or at least comprehensible in some sense, even if deliberations may be in private. So he's trying, I suppose, between Mattis's visit, now Tillerson's visit, and Vice President Pence will travel to Asia next month. He will visit Japan, Indonesia, Korea, and a fourth. I'm just blocking my mind. Philippines could be. So there are those outer manifestations of what I suppose in East Asia leaders have always looked to. Do we see you? Are you present? So in that sense, they are present. But Tillerson, when he was president of ExxonMobil, would travel with very few subordinates. And he's following the same practice on this trip to Asia. He's traveling in a Gulfstream aircraft. There's no big retinue. There's one journalist on the plane, some flaky right-of-center journalist of one sort. The media are free to separately deploy their people and fly separately to Asia, but he's someone who operates below the radar screen. That could either be good or bad. You could say that if he's well briefed and knows the issues, he could do a lot of good. And he's learning as he goes because he had some early missteps. But the presumption is that he's an adult. But the question of the role of the State Department, as it just took at least notionally just a hideous hit in its budget. Although those are the opening exchange of gunfire in this process. It doesn't make it a done deal. I mentioned, of course, then Xi Jinping's impending visit. The question for China and for others is, can we do business with this man? And no one is. There have been arguments about could we be on the cusp of a trade war with China. I really don't think so. And to judge from the comments of senior Chinese leaders, they don't think so either. Besides which, if Trump wants and needs and expects help from China on issues, and North Korea, of course, is high on that list, you're not going to get it if you're doing other things that very, very actively undermine very fundamental Chinese interests. That seems strategy 101. What are the question marks right now? The lack of any sub-cabinet appointments either at defense or at state. This is unprecedented. Unclear the nature of the process that is operating. The severe budget cuts counterbalanced by a surge in defense expenditure, which I don't see as reflecting a change in strategy. It is a reflection of just throwing a lot of money at DoD, presumably to beef up its weapons capacities. But they don't seem. I haven't heard any noises that there's some new design undermined it. So maybe the dirty little secret here is that a lot of what Mr. Trump is doing early on is basically something that's not dissimilar from what President Obama was doing. But he'll kind of like with healthcare. What do you call it? How do you label it? How do you brand it? But in a way, this is heartening. I mean, in effect, as you learn more about the job, as your officials begin to look one hopes in a practical way on the issues of the day, that they'll reflect upon the fact that whatever other political differences might have been there, that maybe your predecessors had something worthwhile that they did while they were there. No one's going to say that, you understand, but I detect it more than a bit. So The big issue, of course, that everyone is talking about, and maybe I'll make a few more comments about it, of course, is the presumption that if there's going to be an early crisis, it will be in Korea, related to North Korea. Let's break that down a little. What is it that would trigger a larger crisis? If you really parse what people say, and this is as much out of government as in, is the belief that North Korea, Kim Jong-un 3.0, as I like to call him, that is on the cusp of an ICBM test. Now, apropos of whether we take countries or leaders literally or seriously, the same would apply, I think, for Mr. Kim. I'm not convinced, even though I know that there are these expressions with great certainty that they're almost there and they're getting ready. In fact, as one of my, I don't want to call it a hobby, it's more than that, but I closely read North Korean propaganda. And lest you think that makes no sense, it does make a lot of sense, because there is a discipline in the way North Korea uses language that is often lost sight of amidst other things like executing your uncle, assassinating your half-brother, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let me find this operative. This is from a pro-North Korean publication emanating from Japan, Chosun Sinbo. And after North Korea fired its, and I love this label, its mid-long range strategic weapon, that's also known as an intermediate ballistic missile. A reporter, and often North Korea uses this newspaper as a kind of a trial balloon. The test fire of this missile that was successfully conducted is tantamount to a preliminary shot for the test launch of an ICBM declared by the DPRK. So the question here is, can North Korea be half pregnant? If the North, watching carefully, observing carefully what the United States does, is convinced that the United States might go to some extraordinary measure, something that Secretary Tillerson intimated as much in a press conference in Seoul just a couple of hours ago, does that induce caution or defiance on the part of North Korea? This is, by the way, quite apart from the purely technical issue. I mean, this, let's not forget, this is rocket science, and it's not easy. North Korea, to my knowledge, and it may be that at a classified level there's other evidence, has never tested even a dummy warhead atop a missile of any range. They've intimated they have a prototype, or more than a prototype. They claim to have a proven design, and in fact they claim that their last nuclear test, in fact, was of an actual warhead. We have no way of knowing. You can make judgments based on yield that is inferred from seismic measurements and the like, but without wishing to sound pedantic, there is only one way to prove that you have a nuclear weapon that can be that you can put atop a missile, and that's to do a test with a weapon atop a missile. And this is one international norm that North Korea has not violated. There has been no test of a nuclear weapon atop a missile in 37 years. 1980, MRBM by China was the last time that this was undertaken. Quite apart from the fact that where and how would you test it, because your options are kind of constrained. You could, from the west coast, do a straight shot south, and maybe, if everything goes right, it wouldn't hit anyone's territory. You could go east, but then it flies over Japan. All of this is besides whether it would actually work. So Kim did not actually promise a weapons test, a missile test, but it is true that in North Korean propaganda, they seem to be edging a little closer. They would say any place, any time. But these are also deterrence signals from North Korea. They're practiced hands at this, often with reference, of course, to impending U.S. military exercises. It's like the Swallows returning to Capistrano. I mean, it's an annual thing. But the stakes have gone up a lot because of the scope and scale of North Korea's testing program over the last year. Approximately 24 ballistic missile launches, 2 nuclear weapons tests. Always the possibility that there could be more. We'll wait and see. But you know, the North Koreans do things in their own fashion. There is another factor here, and this is the other uncertainty that I'll note, and that is that the president of Korea, South Korea, Park Geun-hye, has just imploded and has left office. North Korea did not have to lift a finger to have this happen. They are, I am sure, privately gloating. They kept quite quiet about all of this. And if I were advising young Marshal Kim, not that I am, that I would say to him, esteemed and beloved Marshal Kim, if we play our cards right, in 2 months' time, we will have the kind of government in Seoul that we very strongly prefer. No longer a decidedly right-of-center president, but rather someone who would resume a lot of the activities undertaken under Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Dae-jung towards the north, some distancing from the United States, possibly revisiting the decision on THAAD. So that's one of the reasons why the U.S. and South Korea are trying to move very, very speedily ahead. But that doesn't mean, I mean, even if you have an operational system, it doesn't mean that a future president, most likely Moon Jae-in of the Democratic Party, Minju, that although he's had to waver a bit on this, but I think at the end of the day, Moon is the kind of guy who, having been very, very close with Roh Moo-hyun and having deep, dare I say, almost ideological commitments, really sees his challenge is to define a different kind of South Korean governmental system. Now that resonates with a lot of South Koreans these days, but my point here simply is that for all of the talk emanating from the United States about maybe doing things that in the past we were reluctant to do in Korea, what we are confronting is that, as was the case in the George W. Bush administration, where you had a major strategic divergence between the government in Seoul and the government in Washington, D.C., we could be on the cusp of that one more time. And that is on the to-do list, I think, for the president. So bottom line, because I'm yakking too much, the real question is okay, is there a strategic logic to what he's doing? In Northeast Asia, I think his priorities are clear. They are bilateral, country by country, but in fact, that's often the way most of the time that policy has actually been done in Northeast Asia. The U.S. has always had these two very important anchoring alliances in Northeast Asia. Under some limited circumstances, sometimes Japan and South Korea would cooperate. Often they did not. So in a way, this is closer to what I think is the reality of the way policy has long been conducted. Let's remember, for all the talk about the South China Sea, and what I like to say slightly flippantly is I'm not really concerned about it because this is a problem that global warming will take care of if we can be a little bit patient. But that the core issues are in Northeast Asia. This is where we deploy a disproportionate share of our military assets. This is where we have all the worries about nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons proliferation. This is a place that is armed to an extraordinary extent. I could go on with that, but you know, this is job one for any American president in Northeast Asia, in East Asia rather. And again, if we are on the cusp of a potential crisis in Korea, this could be, depending on how it's handled, the biggest crisis in Asia since the Korean War. So how then do the governments across Asia react? I am sure that in Southeast Asia there is unhappiness about the lack of attentiveness, who's minding the store, who's talking to us. That is a question of prioritization to some extent, but it would seem to me over the longer run, this administration has simply got to bulk up in terms of its personnel. It has to have a process. The problem, and then maybe this is a good ironic closing point, is for any of those who were bad and signed one of these anti-Trump letters, these people are pretty much excluded from serving in the United States government. So where do you turn? And maybe with that closing thought, I'll end my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. A lot of things put onto the table there. And I think the presentation you gave was very sort of careful in drawing attention to continuities as much as discontinuities as well. I certainly remember that in the early days of the Trump administration that there was a tendency among some quarters to graft much more of a strategic vision onto things than was actually there. I remember being told very emphatically, for instance, that the call with Tsai Ing-wen was a carefully considered, deliberate step taken in order to test the Chinese at the start of a new administration, since it was usually in the Chinese habit to test the new administration when he came in. So the idea was you have a phone call, you raise doubts, you put the Chinese on the back foot, and you essentially make them behave in the way that you want. Now, that was just sort of one of those examples.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take some questions and comments before. Yes, Muhammad Ali, please first.
Thank you. Dr. Pollack, as a student myself of U.S.-China relations, I've been a fan for many years of stuff that you've written. The question is in two parts. There's the general question, structural one, if I may. The National Intelligence Council has, over the last 10, 12 years, the last three reports, three consecutive reports, has underscored repeatedly that the system is moving towards steadily, quite clearly moving towards multipolarization. The national security establishment, both congressional and executive branch, on the other hand, have re-emphasized repeatedly a determination to extend unipolarity or certainly systemic primacy. Is that some sort of institutional schizophrenia? Can this be reconciled? Should the Asians worry about this? Does it matter? And a corollary directly to it, if you do not have some sort of considered, deliberate, mutual accommodation tying Japan, China, and the United States, what do you have? What alternatives are feasible and practical? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I think the easy answer would simply be this is less a case of schizophrenia, more the presumed division of labor that should exist between a policy process and an intelligence process. I mean, these reports that the NIC has published with each incoming president, they did one for Bush, they did one for Obama, now they've done one for Trump. And these are things that are deliberated at great length. It involves a lot of outside meetings. I've participated in some of them. But those are ones that are directed towards here's where we think the world is going, as distinct from what are the policy issues that may be in the inherent, I don't want to say insularity of any kind of a decision-making process, but there's a lot of inherited commitments to the idea of quote-unquote U.S. leadership. Now, ironically, some of the words from Trump, at least early on, were that he didn't buy the leadership thing, or he bought leadership directed otherwise. Any implication you're saying, well, these countries should be figured out on their own. That's a very, very different orientation from what most U.S. presidents have sought to achieve. So, but there's a lot of tension here, obviously. If you are not prepared to validate the idea that you have an emerging structure where there is more than one great power, but it's happening under your feet, then any kind of a policy effort looks very, very incomplete. Now, I know that sometimes people have, in some measure, inflated, sometimes because of China's own words, its strategic weight, its strategic depth, although most comments from Chinese officials are much more cautionary about this. But I think that, the intelligence community is, in theory at least, removed from policy, even though it contributes in a very, very direct, ongoing way to policy in various areas. But this is sort of, maybe this is a creative tension, if you will. Maybe that's the benign interpretation you could put on it. The malign interpretation would be those in the executive branch are misreading the bigger trends that are afoot in the world. Because I think that at the end of the day, using Trump as the example, Trump wants a certain measure, shall we say, of deference. He wants some sense that, even as we talk about his America First policy, if it's America First, what does that imply about everybody else? There's some presumption that everyone should follow America's lead, and yet, at the same time, he's talking about pulling back from various kinds of security commitments and obligations. Tillerson said as much the other day, defending the severe cuts in the State Department budget, because he said, well, we're just not going to be doing a lot of that stuff anymore. Well, easier said than done, and we'll wait and see. But I don't know. Maybe in a way, and it's true not only for Republican presidents, but also for Democratic presidents. Is to what extent is the United States really prepared to accept other seats at the table? Very, very frankly, it's one thing to sort of say that we'll consult with ASEAN and all, but ASEAN, they're not great powers. Collectively, they have a certain amount of weight. The real issues here are with big powers, in particular China, potentially India, in a different way Japan, even though Japan's a very different kind of power. And maybe it's just the case that those kinds of long-term issues just don't come up on the radar screen in the same way at high policy-making levels. I know it's not really an answer, but it's an excellent question and worth thinking about.
Great. Yes, please, here in front.
Yes, my name is Fulbright from Vietnam News Agency. Now, what do you think about the relationship between Vietnam and U.S. under the presidency of Donald Trump, which is opportunities and challenges?
That's a very good question, and I don't know offhand whether he has had meeting. Has he met with the Vietnamese ambassador?
No, just telephone call.
Telephone call. Yeah, the telephone calls are sort of sometimes calls can be good, sometimes they're not so good. We know that very angry call that Trump had with Prime Minister Turnbull. Again, my assumption, and because there is so little that is fleshed out in policy terms, I think questions related to Vietnam, building on what was happening under President Obama, suggest to me, just given that Vietnam is a state of real consequence, it has a lot of weight of its own, it's located in a very, very interesting place, that I would think that, particularly in looking at ASEAN, it would not surprise me if Vietnam becomes a major priority there. But in order to do that, we have to have a set of working officials in place. You cannot, in effect, defer or offload or whatever to very senior officials to do everything along the way. So one indication would be whether and when a senior U.S. official travels early to Vietnam. There are questions right now of when Trump himself goes to East Asia for the first time. A lot of us have trouble imagining Trump, given how restless and impatient a man he seems to be, in sitting in too many multilateral gabfests. But and I think therefore he would very likely designate subordinates to play that role. But here again, one of the things we can't really determine is, are there deliberations about this? I respect General McMaster a lot. I wish him all the best. He's got a very, very capable guy, Matt Pottinger, who somebody who has ample Asia experience at the NSC. But that's not enough. That's simply not enough. And this at a time when Trump is arguing that he wants to scale back the size of the U.S. government. The other thing to ask, of course, is what are the signals that Trump is trying to send to American businesses? His desire for bilateral agreements on trade. If I'm an American corporate executive, this could become a very, very muddled process, or a process that, wait a minute, if we have this agreement here with Japan, but that one with if there are all kinds of contradictions and complexities, maybe the art form there is to sort of say, oh, it's just not worth the game. But the problem with that is, and everybody knows, that where is the real growth occurring? I mean, absent still significant dynamism in Asia, the global economy would be even in more trouble than it is already.
A few minutes ago, you put yourself in the shoes of Kim Jong-un's national security advisor and offered some advice.
That's before he gets shot. Right.
Anti-aircraft.
Yeah, right.
If you had to put yourself in an analogous position with regard to Xi Jinping, it's a big year for China, National People's Congress next month, I think it is, and then the Party Congress later in the autumn. There's always sensitivities, positions have to be struck.
Mm-hmm.
It's a particular kind of leadership. There's
right.
a personality issue involved there as well.
Right.
I mean, what would you suspect or advise as to the Chinese approach to Trump?
Well, part of the issue here is who is Xi Jinping? What really animates his behavior and the like? There are some real puzzles there. I mean, he's a party man through and through, more than anything else. He seemingly has arrogated to himself a whole host of jobs that on the face is impossible for him to be able to do all of them. On the other hand, he does delegate. But the question here would be: is there a basis on which Xi Jinping can deal effectively with the United States and with Trump personally in a way that either evades or avoids some bigger test of wills? But the big issue in that context, I would argue, and one that Xi Jinping may not like to have to confront, is what the United States, what the Trump administration, beginning with Tillerson, tell him this weekend on American expectations. And that's particularly with respect to North Korea. Now, I understand that successive American presidents always think China's the key, China's the key, China needs to do more, China needs to rein them in and all that. We don't have the time to go into a long chat about that, but that if that's the ultimate test, what is it that would she be inclined to sort of take a leaf out of Trump's playbook? That is to say, if we'll cooperate with you on this, with not defining cooperation right now, what's in it for China? Transactionalism can be a two-way street. The other aspect, though, is that Xi is just trying to keep a reasonably steady hand on the tiller, particularly economically. The economy is not in a free fall in China. I have a close colleague, David Dollar, who follows these issues very, very closely, and a lot of the hype about what's happening is probably not relevant or not an accurate characterization of where China is economically. But absent solid economic performance and absent Xi being able to realize a lot of his domestic goals, his legacy could be problematic. Now that presumes, many people saying, would he even seek a third term? I think that may be a distinction without a difference. In other words, Xi, if he plays his cards right, he will recruit a standing committee that where he can perform a function as, shall we say, President Emeritus, that in a way that was analogous to what Jiang Zemin did not so long ago. Hu Jintao did not play the role that way, but the other problem here is he's Davos man and all that. I mean, I'm kind of bemused by it all because fundamentally a lot of what China and Xi Jinping promised to do with respect to real economic transitions have simply not happened in China. And if the deal has to be, well, I mean, maybe part of the deal will be Xi will come to the United States rather, with a lot of money in his pocket saying, and here's for your infrastructural investment. Maybe he'd even promised to buy American steel for those projects. But I think Trump sees China, and this is probably the way Xi will in turn see Trump, as disproportionately focused on economic and trade issues, much more than anything else. Trump is probably not going to make much of a fuss about human rights. He has a certain liking for people of some authoritarian disposition, as we note, with his bromance with a certain someone to the east. He doesn't have that same comfort zone, seemingly so far, with China. But with China, given the scale and scope of its economic interests, the fact that Trump has already met with Jack Ma, so there are all these linkages related to this enormous wealth that has been generated in China, and can you find a way to make it work, and can you in the process avoid any of those classic geopolitical tests of will that could diminish and weaken the trade front in profound ways.
We'll take a clutch of a few more questions before we have to wrap up. Gordon Barris at the back, and then you sit in the front.
Gordon Barris, LSE. Just to come back to China CMAS, to what extent can America see China continue to strengthen its case by its presence, that the area within the lines is theirs?
And then in the front.
Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. I would like to ask about bilateral chemistry. First chemistry between Trump and Shinzo Abe, and second chemistry between Angela Merkel and Trump, and third chemistry between Putin and Trump.
Xi Jinping, you mean?
No.
Yeah.
Putin.
Oh, Putin.
Yeah,
Putin.
What is
Oh,
the
God.
difficulties and the differences?
Wow. That could be a whole talk in and of itself. I don't know. I mean, let me.
Sorry, we have one more question
yeah,
just at the back.
Yeah.
But,
Just a quick question. So, Pollock, you mentioned that you're not too concerned about trade war between the US and China, partly because of the nuclear situation. I was wondering what's your thoughts on whether, sort of impending relationship between China, the Trump administration, and the Fed, continuing to currency war, and whether you see that Richard
Let me. These are all very good questions. I'll try to answer them quickly. On the currency front, I mean, this is a case of where Trump, I think, has pulled back because as information gets to him, that you really can't make the case anymore for China being an active currency manipulator. The Chinese, if anything, are trying to enhance the value of their so all their money doesn't flow out. But on the other hand, he's got senior advisors who are obsessed with some of these issues, and that's going to be a question of how real priorities sort out in a policy process. But if the logic of it simply is not there, and if the Chinese, going back to the advice that presumably I would proffer to Xi Jinping, would be find a way to conciliate the Americans, because you have a way to do this, but it would require China to be more responsive in ways that generally they don't like having others intrude on their behavior. But frankly, it's just not a good case. I mean, there are very legitimate issues you can raise with respect to Chinese economic practices, and that was always Obama's big gripe with China. Their thumb was always on the scale. They don't play by the rules. If we don't set up the rules, then China will define the rules. can you find a way, primarily, again, through bilateral mechanisms, maybe even on an investment treaty? I mean, it's not an impossibility if sufficient will is there. And I really think there's a case that can be made for it. And the question is how much energy and effort will the Chinese be prepared to put behind it, and will there be enough of a team on the U.S. side that you could really make meaningful headway? We'll have to see. I'm going in reverse order on the questions. On the chemistry thing, again, Trump is a man with likes and dislikes. It's very, very obvious. I mean, I suppose any leader has that. I've gotten mixed signals on. I mean, he's spent more time with Abe than with any foreign leader, right? I heard some reports that early on that Trump wasn't that taken with Abe, and yet then he was down at Mar-a-Lago and they golfed and they did this and they did that. I just don't see Trump lightly discarding this relationship, but what he's looking for, Trump likes to be validated. He likes to feel that others are, flattering him in a variety of ways. I mean, maybe all political leaders are like that to some extent. And so Abe would have very substantial reasons to try to play ball with them, even though Trump's early priorities, particularly with respect to canceling TPP, are ones that trouble Japan. So the question is, can you reconstitute a TPP arrangement independent of the United States? There's some deliberation going on about that. On Merkel, I don't know. Is she in the States now, or she had to postpone her today? She could give him a lot of insights into Putin. Maybe that's what she should try to do. I don't know. That just she, as we know, Chancellor Merkel, an impressive person. She's uncannily outwitted and outlasted and defeated all these powerful men in the German political system. But I don't get an easy feeling that this will be a comfortable relationship. However, and I would say this thing: one of the puzzles about Trump is that for all of his bluster, for all of his incredibly inappropriate comments about people, and for all of frankly, all the fabrications that he offers on almost a daily basis, the puzzle is that privately, a number of people have indicated that he's a very gracious man. He's personable, gracious, charming host, those kinds of things. That's kind of the private Trump, not the public Trump. So to the degree that these meetings are private, maybe you can make some headway. There will be, I'm told, a press conference, and this is going to be interesting since, as we know, when Trump has had press conferences, he just winds up and goes, and of course, so I don't know exactly how that's going to go. On Putin, it's interesting. Depending on what you believe and when he said it, they either have or have not met in the past. You get a sense right now that whether it's partly because of some of the disclosures about some of the relationships between people in Trump's circle and various Russian interests, that some of the bloom is off the rose of this relationship, seemingly. You're getting some indications from the Russians themselves that they've pulled back from their effusive positive comments in their own media about Trump. So there, and maybe that's healthy, But again, that's where, in some measure, Trump is hoist on his own petard. I mean, he's the one who tried to make this case, and it's looking very, very problematic for reasons that go well beyond whether he likes Putin or doesn't like Putin. Because at a minimum, he doesn't like the idea that things will be disclosed about whatever these relationships were or were not. We'll have to see. Could you repeat your question again, because I didn't write it down?
Yes, it was just to try to get some understanding of how much can the United States tolerate the Chinese strengthening their claims by their physical presence and intimidation of the naval movements
Right,
of others
right.
in the China Sea?
Well, a part of it will depend on what China chooses to do or not do. There is an argument. The Chinese have made this claim periodically that their island construction activity is more or less complete, but until it's no longer complete. The real issue here, frankly, is whether there is any overt coercion by China directed against any of its neighbors. China, as you know, arrived at this game very late in this game. If the Chinese are disgruntled by things that Vietnam holds on to or the Philippines have, well, that was being done decades ago, not recently. So the Chinese are playing what we might call catch-up ball, but they're very big. They can mobilize a lot of these resources quickly. The question is what the ultimate strategy is. Let me postulate here, and there's some very recent indications that the Chinese may be coming around to a view about freedom of navigation, including on military exercises or deployments or traffic, that is not dissimilar from the United States. We're a long way from this being fully developed, but I think some in China recognize that their argument they've been making is just so untenable at so many levels. So do you really want this to spill over into just open-ended animosities with your neighbors? China has not done an effective job at all in that regard. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of these are what we might call, in tennis terms, unforced errors, and these are the puzzles about China and about the way their policy process operates and the advice that Xi Jinping receives, or things that he undertakes of his own determination, irrespective of the consequences, worthy of close attention in the years to come, months to come.
In the 4 years to come.
Yes, right, exactly.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. Absolutely zero signs of jet lag as of yet setting in. So an example to all of us.
Yeah.
Incredibly grateful for that. And
Thank you.
do come back. I know you tomorrow a full day dealing with North Korea at the LSE.
Yeah.
But for now, thanks for that magisterial survey.
Thank
Great,
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.